But I think, throughout the sessions that we've been running with this Design the Digital World, and as Ksenia mentioned, although academics are certainly recognizing that they need to engage with some of these tools and that there's increasing pressure to engage with some of these tools, one of the things that we find people are still struggling with is, how do I measure the impact this is having? How do I report it? How do I make this part of my research reports? And how do I assess whether it was worth my time? So one of the things I wanted to talk about was evaluating the impact of disseminating via social media and other digital tools. And the reason we put this up front in today's session was because evaluating impact is something you have to plan in the early stages of your project. So throughout the afternoon, hopefully we're going to give you examples of how you could increase the impact of your work, but now I want to talk about how you actually plan that impact in from the very early stages. So this is taken straight from the Research Council's UK, talking about how they define impact. Because we all know the importance of it for the Rex, we know the importance of it in many different things, and it's certainly a buzzword. But what does impact actually mean? And I think that's key if we're going to say we're going to start measuring it. So academic impact, significant advances in understanding, method, theory, and application. Generally engaging with other academics, other scholars, industry stakeholders. But then there's also economic and social impact. Research that's of benefits to individuals, organizations, and nations. So those are sort of two very, very broad groupings of types of impact that we can be talking about when we say we're going to try and increase our impact. In addition to that, there's different ways of measuring impact. Most funding sources require that you identify a pathway to impact in your grant writing. And they identify quantitative data, qualitative data, and observational data, which I would argue could probably fall into the first two as well. But quantitative data, when you're talking specifically about digital tools and social media, could be how many people do you engage with on social media? How many people visit your website? How many people download your papers? How many people save your work? How many people started following you on Twitter, started following your project on Twitter? Qualitative is examples in the context of that engagement with different audiences and different stakeholders. And then observational data. Really, I don't like saying anecdotal because I think we tend to dismiss anecdotal as not being very valuable, but it's very concrete examples of why that engagement via social media or digital tools mattered, why it was worth your time. So throughout the day, you're going to see, I think, different examples of how you can use digital tools to have impact. But I also want you to think, as we go through some of the exercises, how are you going to capture that impact? And what would you call it? Is it academic impact? So Melissa's blog, that's an example of academic impact. Articles uploaded to the institution's repository, downloaded citations, right? Societal impact could be engaging with stakeholders and audiences who normally would not have access to a journal article or would not engage with a journal article. And then furthermore, are we just looking at how many times it was downloaded or cited, or are we looking at what people did with it, how they interacted with some of that content? The other thing is to make sure that, I'm sure you've seen this used either in relation to impact or goal setting for sport or something like that, but have SMART objectives. These are objectives that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. That's key. If you're going to measure the impact of your work, is setting the parameters. Because as you'll see, when you start going into the social media, you start going to some of the online content, it can spin out of control very quickly. It's you follow an interesting link, you follow another interesting link, and you find a new tool, but at the end, were you actually measuring what you said you were going to measure? And how do you know when to stop collecting that information? And do you get too caught up in the numbers and less caught up in whether or not it was relevant or specific to your goals? But specifically today, we're going to be looking at how do you measure the impact, because that's key to reporting. So I'm going to pass quickly back over to Ksenia. She's going to show you how they measured the impact and how they plan to measure impact in their projects. Thanks.
Right, so one of the projects I'm working on, it's a European project, it's called Evolving Concept of Security. So we have a separate work package which is responsible for dissemination and impact. That's all they do. They don't do anything else. So from the very beginning, from the putting proposal together, we knew that this is what we want to do, and that was one of our pathways to impact. So this work package, they're required to report on different dissemination activities and the impact we're making as a project together every 6 months. So the data I'm going to show you is from the first 6 months because we haven't received the second 6 months yet. So the numbers are going to be quite low. So you can see, so we have a website, like pretty much every project now. And what basically based on Google Analysis data, we can see who is visiting, how many sessions the website been run for, and so on and so forth. We can also see the geographical coverage of websites visited, because for us it is very important. We're looking at how security is understood in Europe, so we want the geographical coverage to be as wide as possible. We then know that the security stakeholders are looking at our website. And we are also interested in what the stakeholders are trying to figure out, what they're trying to find on our website. So this is also quite a good statistic to see what things are interesting, and maybe what we can sort of put more information on pictures to attract the attention at. So this work package, they also run our social media pages, and then they report back. So we have a Facebook page, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Again, the numbers are very low here because this is the first 6 months, but the project just started. We didn't have any workshops yet or anything like that. However, now, well, what we see is that for us, Twitter is the best tool. And the highest impact of downloaded reports, deliverables, and so on is from Twitter. So people follow the links on Twitter. We don't have many followers. I think we only have 180 followers, but they're very high-profile followers. So we have a head of UNDP, people from the Cabinet Office, people from Swedish Ministry of Defense, and people like that. They're really, really high-profile. So when, say, one of our tweets goes retweeted by the head of Resilient Cities campaign in UNDP, we then had 600 retweets, simply because he has a massive followers base. So this is the kind of the things you're looking for if you want to increase your impact. For us, it's great, and hopefully any project would achieve something like that. So yeah, we could do that potentially here. Thanks.
So Ksenia is obviously an example of quantitative data they've been collecting. I should mention, it is specific to the goals of their project. So their project's European, they want to make sure they have broad coverage. So having the numbers from Google Analytics and where their site's being visited from is very important. If you're doing a project that is very local, that would be a relevant number to you. But you might be looking at, for example, the different platforms and stuff like that. But the key is that they plan to measure that from the start. This is very hard information to get in retrospect. And also, when you start measuring from the start, you have these 6-month updates or whatever makes sense for your project's timelines, then it also lets you focus your attention on the tools that are actually getting you the better return. They know Twitter is a useful one for them. I'm guessing they're spending, whether consciously or unconsciously, they're now spending more time on their presence on Twitter and realizing that perhaps Google Plus is not getting them their biggest returns. In my PhD work, I also had a blog and used Google Analytics, and it gave me similar numbers to what they had, in the sense that I could see 90 plus countries. I had readers from 90 plus countries on my blog. Now, 80% of those were from Canada, the UK, and the US. Given that my blog was about the Paralympic Games and was written in English, those are 3 countries with huge Paralympic programs and English speaking. So, I put 90 countries up because it was kind of impressive, I thought, but equally, my focus was on 3 or 4 countries. What was interesting, though, to me, was that I could tell when I was getting, where my visitors were coming from. So if there was a Paralympic event, a parasport event, being held in Norway, suddenly Norway would peak that week. So I could tell these were actually my readers who were moving to different events, rather than sort of new audiences who are engaging. A few things though, I have a timeline. I said this is how long I'm going to measure it for. This is just so you can start comparing apples to apples. I know my readership increased from my first blog post to my last blog post. I know which blog posts were the most popular with which audiences, because I was set up to measure that. The other thing that was kind of fun, I guess, is to put this up on the website, which is, it's a map with dots of where all the readers are. And if someone was currently reading in Loughborough, you'd see Loughborough flashing, right? But it was a way of, when a reader came, they would see, oh, someone else is actually reading as well. So it made the page look a little more dynamic, a little more exciting. Even if I wasn't, I hadn't posted something new that week, people who visited could still see that people were engaging with it. So it was a very simple tool. But my interest was really more in some of the qualitative ways of measuring the impact. So, for example, one of my key things was to engage Paralympic stakeholders in discussions about disability sport and disability sport policy. So obviously, biggest stakeholder of the Paralympic movement is the International Paralympic Committee. When they started tweeting the link to the blog and directing their audience to it, that was very, very useful for me. And that's one way I was able to demonstrate the impact of my work when writing up the project. To say that, here is concrete evidence that people at the International Paralympic Committee were not only reading the blog, but were sending it out and helping to increase the readership of the blog. So when things like this happened, I immediately took a screenshot. And I just had, it was a Word document, take a screenshot, copy and paste, dropped it in. At the end of the project, I have this huge Word document that has concrete evidence of how I engage with different audiences. Because if you try to go back and find this on Twitter 10 months later, you might, but you might not. They could have taken it down. You could have simply had so many tweets that Twitter started deleting them to save space. It's hard to find unless you're prepared to capture it. Other things I used, and this would fall under, I think, the observational data, would be I would capture entire conversations on Twitter. Because that was one of our goals, was not to just get people reading the blog, but to have people having conversations around the topic. So what would happen first is the Canadian Paralympic team tweeted out the link to an article that we posted, and then a couple, actually a Paralympian and Paralympic coach started talking about the article. And I'm following this on Twitter, I see this conversation happening. Once again, screenshot it. And then when I'm presenting this at a conference, it's my visual, but it's also, I can then go on and write about the different communities we engaged with. But here's a very visual example for people of what did that engagement look like? How were people talking about the project? But the point I want to make is you have to plan for this in advance. First of all, you'll forget about it. Second of all, it's hard to capture. The other thing too is, depending on the scope of your project and the resources available to you, you can write this into a program's budget and timeline and your grant application. So, Ksenia said they have an entire group. This is their work, is that dissemination and capturing the impact. I was doing this as a PhD student. I didn't have a lot of outside resources, but projects I now do, plan a budget for creating a video, plan a budget for building a website, put that in advance, because you're not going to be able to measure it later unless you do that to start.